I'm going to hit on some things today that will tie into a lot of the themes we discussed yesterday, where Lee and Grant have evolving opinions of each other. And that's really going to impact the action as it unfolds today. We're also going to talk about a lot of missed opportunities. I'm going to talk about moments of contingency. We're going to really talk about how the attrition that Grant talked about is really going to play out not just on these armies, but on the commanders themselves. And what's really fascinating to me about this is that attrition really is going to manifest itself not just in those armies, but in Lee and in Grant. He's going to be sleeping about 3 hours a night at this point. So you can imagine how punch-drunk, exhausted the man is. And he's going to start to come down with a terrible case of dysentery. Grant also not getting enough sleep. And so we're going to see the health of these men deteriorate and affect their decision-making capabilities in really startling ways. We tend to think of the Overland Campaign and the fires of the wilderness and how horrific that was, and the epic bloodletting that happens at Spotsylvania. And then people sort of jump ahead to Cold Harbor and those charges that Grant said that he ever after regretted. And we forget about this third epic, as the veterans themselves described it, the third epic of the campaign, which to me is the most fascinating because we have all of these different components going in and all of these missed opportunities. And I'm going to focus on some of those today, and you'll be able to be like, oh my gosh, and see just how these missed opportunities could have drastically impacted the way this campaign unfolded. Now, you're going to see one of the most rare things in the Civil War world, and that's a Chris Mackowski PowerPoint today. Pardon me as I muddle through it, but I had maps made up specially for you, since you guys were kind enough to fly me across the ocean. I figured I should do something nice for you. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But we're going to start on the afternoon of the 25th of May. So we're jumping ahead a few days from Spotsylvania, but I'll fill in that gap for us. And after a couple days of unsure contact along the North Anna River, Grant has come to the south bank of his headquarters near an old mill called Coral's Mill. And he's sitting there around the campfire with his staff, and this old woman comes over. She lives nearby. And Horace Porter, one of Grant's staff members, offers this wonderful description of her. And I like the fact that she squeaked like high notes of an E-flat clarinet. I mean, what a great description. And she said, she just sits down with Grant, and she's just striking up a conversation, and he's amused by this whole thing. And she says to him, well, I was just glad that General Lee been licking you clear out from the left end of here. And now he has you right where he wants you. Grant chuckles along, and they chat a little bit, and he eventually sends an orderly with her over to her house to guard the house. But as far as like, geez, General Lee's got you right where he wants you. And the previous day, it certainly seemed like it, because Lee had set a trap on the banks of the North Anna River. And Grant had stumbled into it. And then nothing happened. And Grant was able to sort of extricate himself from the danger and finally eventually come and sit down and have this conversation. And he's going to start thinking, like, well, yeah, I thought maybe Lee did have me right where he wanted. But maybe not, because I've escaped the game. He's going to draw some interesting conclusions from that. He gets to the North Anna River from Spotsylvania because, as we mentioned, after the Battle of Harris Farm, they had cut the supply lines off in this direction, waiting for more Confederate shenanigans. That happens. He pulls out and heads south. So if we take a look at kind of the campaign so far, we can see up here the wilderness, the two fronts that Frank talked so well about. We come down here to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and then after 2 weeks of fighting there, Grant's going to look to do the same thing. There's no turning back, as he had said. And so he's going to look to head toward Richmond. But he's going to try something different. And again, Grant has this bum reputation for frontal assaults, Grant the Butcher, which of course is just nonsense. We've tried innovation, that new attack that Upton launched in Spotsylvania. We've tried maneuver. We have tried those frontal attacks. Now Grant's going to try a little trickery. So what he wants to do is try to lure Lee out of those defenses of Spotsylvania. Now, Frank mentioned this quote yesterday, which I think is really important context for today's discussion. and he's sort of dismissing Bobby Lee. And I want you to stop thinking about what he's going to do. We need to pay attention to what we're going to do to him. And after 2.5 weeks of fighting, we're going to see Grant's attitude start to shift. He's going to pay a little bit more attention to what Lee might be doing to him. It's one of those hard lessons that Robert E. Lee teaches Ulysses S. Grant in the early days of this campaign. So what Grant wants to do is actually leave Spotsylvania. Let's see if I can operate the technology. Probably. Oh, no, look at that. So what he's going to do is send Hancock's Second Corps on a wide flanking maneuver and dangle him out as bait.
Top button, Chris. Is the top button on your
top button there? Oh, there. Oh, I did. There we go. See? I'm not used to this stuff. So send him right down here and dangle him as bait. So if this is Spotsylvania, and Darren is sitting along the North Anna River in the back of the room, really what Hancock should do is just come right down the middle aisle and head down to the camera. But instead, he's going to swing wide along the far wall. He's been authorized to go all the way to the North Anna River, which is down here, and even go as far as Hanover Junction, which is a vital Confederate supply depot, bringing supplies up from Richmond and also from the west of the Shenandoah Valley. Hancock can go that far if he wants to. And the idea is that if he's dangling out there as bait, Lee, being ever aggressive, is going to find some way to pounce on that isolated part of the army. And when Lee makes that move, Grant's going to pounce with the rest of his. And so that's the idea, is to try to lure Lee out of these works into an open field fight, where Grant can use these superior numbers. Well, let's think about those numbers for a second, because that's another thing that makes this phase of the campaign so intriguing. Grant starts out with 120,000 men. By the time he pulls out of Spotsylvania, between the casualties he has lost, between Psycho Phil Sheridan riding off with 13,000 cavalry, which Grant will talk about in a little while, between the men that have to guard the supply trains, he's going to be down to about 68,000 men. We talked about it by no other means than attrition. He's down to like 68,000 men, and that's after he's had close to 14,000 reinforcements start to come in, all green, because he's stripping the defenses of Washington. Okay? He's just going to keep marching on. By this point, if Lee started with 66,000 men, he's lost so many men through the wilderness, through Spotsylvania. He's going to be able to tap into some reinforcements here in just a few minutes. He's going to get himself up to about 55,000 again. All right? It's going to be as numerically close as the armies will ever be. 68 to 54. So again, think about the potential that Lee has in this scenario. But of course, the armchair generals start yakking almost right away. Whoops, look at that. Edward Porter Alexander, in his fantastic memoir, later reflecting on this moment, said that if Grant had started this movement as a race to the North Anna, he would have won. In other words, instead of going out along the wall, what if he goes straight down toward Darren? What would that have looked like? Here's this, again, the first big question. What if Grant just goes to the North Anna River? And so, here's what Hancock actually does. You're getting all these fancy new maps. Here's what he might have done. Look at this, okay? What if he'd gone straight down there? Richard Ewell starts this movement right here to Mud Tavern at about 3 o'clock in the morning. By that point, Hancock's already well on the way. Hancock would have gotten to this intersection first, followed by Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps. So if we think about Grant wanting to lure a portion of Lee's army out so that he could attack it, he could have achieved that in the way that Lee actually responds to what happens. We could have had the great Battle of Mud Tavern instead of North Anna River. But then, let's say that he gets the jump on this, secures that intersection, and instead of fighting there, uses his position to protect that intersection, and he could have marched all the way down here to the North Anna River. Well, I have no idea what his position would have looked like, but let's just assume that if Grant got there first, he knows he's got to block the river and put up a defensive position. He's going to block the fords at the different mills. We know that he knows those fords are there because he will eventually use them to cross the river when he finally gets there. So, and then of course he's got one bit of cavalry under Alfred Torbert. Let's put him down in here just to guard the flanks. And again, I'm just supposing, but knowing that Meade was very traditional in his use of cavalry as a flank guarding function, it's probably safe to assume that this might look like this. So this is just sort of a rough idea. So if Grant gets to the North Anna first, he's cut off Lee's supply lines, both from Richmond and from the Valley. This would precipitate a crisis for Lee, wouldn't it? He's cut off from his supplies. Does he try to make a mad dash up to Washington and shake the leaves that way, which, of course, as we talked about yesterday, is something that he is kind of keeping in the back of his mind? But, by this point, Grant's feeling pretty confident about those defenses in Washington, so he's probably not going to react in any sort of panicked way. And, of course, if he does plunge northward, he gets farther away from his cut supply line, so that becomes problematic. Lee's not going to do a frontal assault here because Lee already knows what a strong position the North Anna is. He has been looking at the North Anna as a defensive position since November of '62. If it had been up to Lee, the Battle of Fredericksburg would have taken place here. And it was only Jefferson Davis who said, no, you can't give up that much free real estate. You've got to defend the Rappahannock. Okay? And so that's why Fredericksburg happens in Fredericksburg. Now, so Lee certainly would not attack this if he was in reverse positions. So would he try to go around the flanks? Well, he could go down here. That's ultimately what he thinks Grant would do. He could try to get up around here. And if Lee does get on Grant's flanks, who knows what's going to happen? That's one of Lee's favorite maneuvers. But suddenly we see, had Grant done this, we've got this first great missed opportunity right at the offset. This becomes a critically imperative situation for Lee to solve. And his options really dwindle. He's got no good options. But of course, that's not what happens. And I only point it out because I want you to see all of the potential things that might have happened over the course of this. And that's why it's so fascinating to me. Instead, we do have Hancock going to march right down in that direction. What Grant wants to then do is send Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps down the Telegraph Road, just as we had talked about, to secure this intersection. But as Hancock makes this march, his men are in high spirits. They're going through a portion of Virginia that has not been touched by the hard hand of war. There's a full moon out as they make their night march, as the 20th turns to the 21st. They're marching through newly sown fields of tobacco and corn. Their spirits are high, particularly since they've left the terrible landscape of Spotsylvania. Things seem fresh. They sing. Their cavalry escort keeping them safe until Confederates ambush them. And that sort of wakes them up, like, ooh, we ought to be paying attention. The 9th Virginia Cavalry has a detachment that's trying to contest this advance a little bit. They don't have nearly the strength to actually stop them, so they try to spring up some ambushes. The Torbert's men are alert. But what those Confederate cavalry do succeed in doing is making the communication chain back to Grant tenuous. And so as Grant sends messages to Hancock, and Hancock sends messages to Grant, it takes hours and hours and hours for those messages to get through, sometimes not getting through at all. And that starts to make Grant nervous. And the man who is supremely confident starts to lose his nerve. And instead of sending Warren down the road to either capture this intersection or engage with any Confederates that may be there, he's going to send Warren here to follow Hancock as support. Now, it's a reasonable change of plan. But for the man who said, let's not worry about what Lee's doing, we're going to follow our own plans, we're starting to learn the lessons that Lee has taught us. So as a result, again, here's another situation where the Battle of Mud Tavern might have happened, which is exactly the kind of fight that Grant is hoping for, and he sort of basically gives up his own opportunity to carry out the very sort of situation he wants to have happen. He'll later say in his memoirs that Lee now had an excellent opportunity to take the offense and strike a blow of his own. Because as we look back on this, Grant points out his troops are spread over an arc of 25 miles. And so either Hill and Anderson could hit Burnside and Wright, who are holding the rear guard. We could have Ewell strike out and hit Warren in any of these places through here. We could isolate Hancock down there and go after him. Grant looked back afterwards and was like, oh, I can't believe I let that happen. But because he's starting to second guess himself, he's starting to lose confidence in his own vision and plan, he's starting to set himself up for potential trouble. And he recognizes that later. But he says this was really Lee's last opportunity to strike a blow that could have knocked me off. Now, that's a pretty interesting statement when we take a look at other opportunities Lee's going to have. But here is this lost opportunity that will never come back to Lee. So what if Lee had struck that heavy blow? What might have happened to the Union Army stretched out like it was, or isolated in different ways? Of course, we'll never know, but I want us to be thinking about the ramifications of some of these decisions. So instead, we've got Hancock marching all the way down. His cavalry gets to Bowling Green at about 7 o'clock, followed by the infantry at 9. They start looting the town, getting supplies for themselves. Torbert goes forward and gets to a place called Milford Station, and there, unexpectedly, he's ambushed by about 500 Confederates. And so Torbert's got about 2,000 men. He drives those Confederates out of there. Hancock and his column arrive there at about 12:30, but he's like, what do you mean Confederates? That are not from Robert E. Lee's army. And this really unnerves Hancock, who is now 25 miles out here, all by himself, detached from the rest of the army, no clear communication going on. And Hancock the suburb suddenly becomes Hancock the stationary. He will dig in rather than pushing onwards. So Lee says that he doesn't strike that blow because he's trying to make sense, and Frank will get into that this afternoon. So what information he is getting is scattered, it's confusing. As he writes to Jefferson Davis, he says that he's just trying to puzzle this out. And because he's not sure what Grant's up to, he doesn't want to make a move that's going to get him in trouble. So the aggressive Lee starts to play it conservative. So we're seeing commanders now play against their own nature, both Grant and Lee and Hancock. Because the hard lessons that this campaign has taught all of these men about their opponents. And this is a whole new war. And of course, the fact that it's just been unrelenting warfare is something new as well. These men are exhausted from fighting continually. They're exhausted, they're sick, they're tired, they're unsure, they're frustrated, and they're nervous. E.P. Alexander does say, though, that if Hancock moved and it turned out to be a trap, they don't spring the trap, no big deal. But at the very least, it's a turning movement. It outflanks Lee and forces Lee out of those works at Spotsylvania. So if nothing else, the Federals do achieve that. And so what Lee's going to do is set his sights on the North Anna River. He's finally going to get to use that defensive position that he has been looking at for a year and a half. And he will send Ewell out. He's guarded that intersection as we've seen on the map. And when it seems clear that the Federals aren't going in that direction, he's going to send Ewell south to try to secure the crossing at the North Anna. And he's going to send Richard Anderson's corps into position to hold this instead. And so we talked a little bit, Jeremy in his great presentation yesterday talked about these rivers, which Frank pointed out, flow from west to east. And we can see here at Jericho Mills, one of the river crossings, look how steep that bank is. And that's the north bank. South bank, look how steep that is. federal engineers are gonna have to cut a road when they eventually do get here, because this is too steep for their artillery and their wagons. And this isn't just the bank here, there's this little plateau, and then there's this bank here. Here at Jericho Mills, one reason there's a ford is because the river is as wide as it is. But along most of its length, the North Anna is more narrow with steeper banks, making that a harder river to cross. At the fords, the south banks tend to dominate the north banks, meaning if you can get across the river, you can then control those river crossings for anyone who's trying to come across. And just to add one more little twist, because these guys don't have apps on their phone that tell them what the weather's going to be, you got to be worried that it might rain. And it fills these narrow river gorges up deep and quick. For those of you who've been down through that direction, there's a bridge that crosses the North Anna along Route 1. And it's 30 feet above the river. And I have seen the remains of floodwater that have been up over that bridge. So if you get to one of those rivers and get part of your army across, or get your infantry without your wagons or your artillery, and the water comes up, people are trapped. So you always have to approach these rivers with extreme caution. And that's why Lee sees that as such a prize. If he can get over there, there's a lot of topography that he can work with. And that's why he sees this as such a lost opportunity for Grant, who has been trying his little bit of trickery. So, as Lee gets his men on the march, Ewell will head down first, and he's going to send Anderson to hold that intersection. Meanwhile, Hancock, down here all by himself, as Second Corps historian Frank Walker said, he's out there by himself, poor communications. It's no wonder that he's going to set up some detention. He does drive off those Confederates, but here we have Kemper's brigade. Of course, he's going to actually get off at Panola Station and head this way and then block the road here, so that if Hancock does try to break out, they're blocking the road in two places down toward the North Anna. Late in the day, on the 21st, Wade Hampton, Confederate cavalry commander, shows up, and he sees the situation, and he sees potential opportunity. So he's going to try to come up with some ideas for ways to exploit this. But let's think just for a second. What if Hancock, instead of digging in, what if he had pushed forward, as his orders had authorized him to do so? And so we can see here, if he had, of course he's got to go through Kemper, and of course he gets the jump just based on timing on where Lee is. When you cross the river, there's John Breckinridge, freshly arrived from his victory at the Battle of Newmarket with about 3,200 men. Breckinridge has been stationed at Hanover Junction to protect that rail depot because it's so important to Lee's supply lines. He's been driving off pesky federal cavalry raids. And so, I only imagine Hancock marching 25 miles to Milford Station. He's got another 8 miles to go to get to the North Anna River, and another 3 miles to Hanover Junction, where he then has to fight fresh Confederate troops who are coming off of victory. So, obviously, Hancock, even though he makes the decision out of an abundance of concern, would probably have marched himself into disaster had he continued forward. Okay? And if any of these Confederates had consolidated, which is exactly what Wade Hampton wants to do. When he sees Hancock there, he's like, I can cut them off on this bridge right here, which would then leave them vulnerable and isolated. And if we kind of combine these guys, and he sends down to Breckinridge and says, send me some guys up, and there'd still be 2-1 in federal advantage, and they would be holding the defense. They would be isolated, they'd be exhausted. Hampton looking to make something happen in the wake of Jeb Stuart's death. Again, we can't gameplay these things. I think this is why we don't like what ifs, because a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, Wade Hampton, he'd go in there and boom, boom, boom. We don't know. There's no way to answer that. My job is to just put some things into your head so you can think about what's going on in these moments, and what are the stakes, and why is this so important for us to pay attention to? And we can start to see missed opportunity after missed opportunity. And that, to me, is the point of this whole phase of the campaign and why it's so fascinating. That war of attrition, is wearing these guys down. If Breckinridge had sent Hampton some additional infantry, we don't know exactly, but we know that Hampton would have tried to do something. It also would have left the supply depot at Hanover Junction open and exposed. That's a security risk that Breckinridge knows is too much of a cost to pay, and that's why he doesn't move forward. So as we've got all this going on with Hancock, we've got Warren now following in his footsteps, and so Warren's going to be kind of off in this direction. The next federal corps to move out of Spotsylvania is going to be Ambrose Burnside. And as he later reports, he was ordered to follow in the footsteps of the 5th Corps, get to the Telegraph Road, push forward if able, and secure this road. Since that's originally what Warren was supposed to do, Warren's off that way, Burnside's got to come down here. And he says, effect a crossing if it could not be done with too great of opposition. And we all know, as I mentioned yesterday, Burnside, the paragon of mediocrity. He gets the Telegraph Road, he starts moving south. By this point, Richard Ewell has already headed south, but he has sent a company of cavalry to block the road, and he sent a squad of engineers to dig fortifications. And so when Burnside gets to a little trickle called the Nye River, which again, narrow but steep bank, narrow and deep with steep banks, Burnside's got to get across it. And there are Confederates on the other side. By the time he gets there, it's getting to be dark. He doesn't know what sort of opposition that he's facing. So he's going to try to outflank. He's going to try to outflank, but his men can't kind of find the ends, and he doesn't know. And so he's like, you know what, I shouldn't do this. I could be putting myself into jeopardy. He's going to turn his men around. And instead of just having everybody do this, he actually has the front of his column do this. That then brings them back up into this intersection where Horatio Wright's 6th Corps is now coming. So now we've got a traffic jam. And Wright's got to wait for Burnside to get out of the way before he can continue onward. But what if Burnside had forced a crossing at the Po River? Here we can see, he gets down there, sees the little small crossings, the Confederates do bring down one artillery piece. He comes and he backs up this way. But if he had pushed through and gotten that Mud Tavern intersection, he would have arrived before Anderson. Again, securing that key crossroads, either catching Anderson on the march and forcing a battle, which then would have allowed Warren to come in this way, Wright to come in as reinforcements. We still have 3/4 of the army there against Anderson's one isolated corps. Or if Anderson would have backed up, he would have traffic jammed with Hill, who would have maybe tried to get in or tried to. So again, we don't know exactly what would have happened, but if Grant was looking to isolate a portion of Lee's army and pounce on him, could have happened right here. Could have then isolated Ewell down here, who maybe could have come up, but he could have tried to go after his objective, getting across the river without clear communication from Lee. We don't know how he might have reacted, but that leaves him down here in a one-on-one with Hancock. So the potential, had Burnside taken some initiative, pushed across the river, he's only got just some scouts, right? Pushed across the river. Imagine how this campaign could have turned out here. But of course it doesn't. Burnside sticking to type, hooks back up and around.
Burnside said enough of forcing his way over rivers.
That is true. Yeah, he's probably having flashbacks to around the head. What am I going to do? So, back here. So we're going to have Ewell down here. We're going to have Anderson coming through here. We've got Warren here. And as Anderson finally gets to this intersection, starts heading south, Warren's men are off in this direction, and their pickets pick up the movement. Like, oh, we've got Confederates marching across our front. And Warren, in spectacular Warren mode, says, well, we will be prepared to move by tomorrow morning at 4. Why are we waiting hours to do anything? And then when he does do something, he's planning to reposition his men to receive an attack. As opposed to hey, let's get ready to go attack these guys that are marching across our front. And this, again, is a dumb rookie mistake by Lee, who is marching his army across the front of the enemy. Hey guys, look, nobody does that. You just get yourself torn up. But because it's Governor K. Warren, who has a long history of not taking the offensive, of not taking the initiative, Anderson is able to escape. It was just that if Warren had thought offensively instead of defensively. And these, again, are the sort of what-if questions. It's impossible to answer because it would require us to have a different Governor K. Warren. Warren's not capable of this sort of lead. But what if that had been Hancock, for instance? How would Hancock have reacted to something like that? If Grant had been there, how might he have reacted? He's traveling with the 5th Corps, but at that point his headquarters is away from Warren. And so he's not able to push this out. So, but if we look, the way Warren's positioned, he'd be slamming right into the flanks of Anderson's flank column. What would that have done to the Confederate Army? Split them in two. And you'd have Ewell isolated to the south, you'd have Hill trying to make his way down through here, technically within supporting distance. Wow, what a missed opportunity. March your army across the face of Europe. Warren's like, yeah, look at them. And by 4 in the morning, Anderson's passed. Sunrise comes, and Warren's like, oh, they must have gotten scared, ran away from me, right? And so this opportunity slips away. Warren is going to come out, he's going to take the road, Wright's going to take the road, they're all going to kind of filter down through and head to the North Anna River. They're going to scoop up the last stragglers from Anderson's quarters they go. And here as we jump to a Hal Jesperson map from a Edward Alexander map, we can see the Federal Army sort of weaving through all these country roads as Lee makes his beeline back to the North End. Lee will get within about 8 miles of the river by the night of the 21st. He'll get a couple hours of sleep, and in the morning he'll finally cross on the 22nd. As he does, the first person to greet him is Jubal Early, who was leading the vanguard of Ewell's men to secure that crossing. And Lee says, General Early, you must see to the defense of this position. And Early says, well, General Lee, my men are exhausted and they're tired from marching. And Lee snaps at him and says, General Early, I do not want to hear such things. When I tell you to do something, you must obey what I ask you to do. And then he rides off. Early looks at one of his subordinates and he says, General Lee is not well-mannered. And indeed it's not. He's peaked, got the sweats. The dysentery that I mentioned earlier is really starting to kick up. In fact, when Lee starts to inspect his lines later, he'll do so from a carriage instead of from horseback because he's too weakened by his condition, too exhausted. Okay, but he doesn't follow up with Early to make sure that Early gets his guys to dig in. They leave some men on the north bank of the river to kind of secure the crossing for any other stragglers to come. But otherwise, Lee sends word to his army, just rest. We've had a hard march, rest. So Andrew Humphreys, Chief of Staff of the Union Army, as he reflects back on all of this, really thinks that Hancock could have won that race. If this had started as a race to the North Anna, instead of this little bit of attempted trickery, Grant could have succeeded in securing that river crossing. He could have arrived there before Lee entrenched. But what they don't realize is when Lee arrives there first, Lee doesn't entrench. As Lee's trying to figure out what Grant's up to, and he knows all this movement's been going in this direction, Lee becomes convinced that Grant's shifting to the southeast to the Pamunkey River, where the North Anna combines with the South Anna and creates the Pamunkey. So Lee wants to give his men the time to rest so they can shift and pivot down to block that river crossing. But at the beginning of this campaign, when Grant is laying out his objectives, and as we've talked, Richmond's not important. It's Lee's army. Grant told Meade, where Lee goes, you shall go too. Lee has gone to the North Anna River, so Grant is not shifting around him. He's going to the North Anna River too. And he's going to shift over. So what would imagine if Lee had ordered his men to retreat? But because he doesn't, if he had, it sort of looked exactly like this, which is why I had Edward Alexander make these defensive positions purple, because they could have been Confederate positions as well as Federal positions, depending on who might have gotten there and what they might have done. But Lee's got these crossings here, which he does not really dig in and defend right away. He doesn't really do much over here, because he's expecting to move his army down here. He doesn't think he's going to be very far. So, when Grant does advance, he's probably going to kind of come in this direction, split his army up, cross over here at Jericho Mills, come down to the Chesterfield Bridge, which is lightly defended. Torbert's cavalry leads the way. And in fact, Lee is sitting on the porch of a brick house called Ellington, the Fox House. Reverend Fox is treating him to a glass of buttermilk. Lee's been out inspecting his lines. And he had heard reports of this cavalry. He had told A.P. Hill, whose men are down in this direction, don't dig in, we're going to be moving, let them rest. When the cavalry first shows up, he's convinced that it's a feint. It's just to screen Grant's movement as Grant shifts in this direction. But as he sits there on the porch of the Fox House in the afternoon of the 23rd, and he's sipping some buttermilk, Federal artillery deploys on the ridge across the river from him and opens up. One of those cannonballs comes careening in, nearly killing him. Lodges in the door frame of the Fox House, right next to him. In fact, if you go there, that's property that is preserved now by the American Battlefield Trust. The gouge in the door frame is still there. You can see what a near miss it was. He finishes his buttermilk, passes the glass to Reverend Fox, and says, "I must be off," as artillery shells continue to rain in. One hits the chimney of the house, sending a cascade of bricks down that kills an orderly and nearly wounds one of Jackson's staff members, or one of Lee's staff members. And Lee's going to go off and try to figure out what to do now. His men are not dug in. He's got them ready to move, ready to fight. And so, Winfield Scott Hancock will successfully capture this bridge. Confederates will successfully burn this one, but Federals will hold this one. They have essentially been given a free crossing over the North Anna River. This defensive position that Lee has drooled over for a year and a half. And the Federals already have a key. They quickly sweep over a small defensive position on the north bank called Hennigan's Redoubt. Just a massive attack by Hancock's full corps, and he calls it one of the most majestic attacks of the entire war, so definitive in its purpose. You know, the 4 corps, South Carolina regiments that are there all get scattered away. It's not much of a match at all, but it becomes key for offering that crossing. Meanwhile, the 5th Corps and 6th Corps have come up here to Jericho Mills. Confederates have some cavalry out there that are scouting. It's Rooney Lee, commander's son, who sees the Federal movement, and he reports back to A.P. Hill that we've got 2 divisions of cavalry that are trying to cross the river there. So Hill, even though he's been told not to dig in, decides that he's going to investigate. So he's going to send the division of Cadmus Wilcox out toward Jericho Mills, even as the entire 5th Corps starts spilling across the river. Now, the way the river is bend right here, we've got kind of like this nice little bow, and so what Warren wants to do is seal this off so that he can protect this entire plateau, allow his men to deploy, give them room to get ready, and then the 6th Corps, which is right behind them on this side of the river, will have space to come up too, and they'll be able to advance from this well-protected base. It's as Warren's men are deploying through here that Wilcox first shows up. We've got James Lane's North Carolinians. We talked about how they saved the day at Spotsylvania during the Battle of the Bloody Angle. Here we got Sam McGowan still being led by Brown, because McGowan's recovering from his Spotsy wound. We've got some Georgians. We've got some more North Carolinians. And as the Federals are trying to deploy, that's when the Confederates attack. And they fall into this hole where the Federals have not yet deploy. We've got some fantastic federal units on the field here. Anybody here an Iron Brigade fan? Sorry. Bad day. Anybody here a fan of the Bucktails? I know everyone reenactor. Yeah, sorry. Bad day. Okay. I feel so bad for the Iron Brigade in the Overland Campaign because they just had such trouble in town. And so the Confederates start sweeping the field, driving the 5th Corps back. Got them all bottlenecked in this bow in the river. Then we have a fantastic act of individual heroism. Charles Mink takes his battery out onto this little ridge and he sets up and he just starts blasting away in an attempt to buy time. And it's just enough to catch these Georgians in this ravine. And then they get caught in the crossfire as these Federals deploy, and it completely guts the Confederate momentum. And what Cadmus Wilcox thought was going to be an easy victory, because it appeared to be, is entirely turned into disaster by the heroism of Charles Mink, which buys enough time for the 5th Corps to react, redeploy, and then drive the Confederates off the field. Some great stories of this fight as livestock is running wild through the forest, and some of the North Carolinians are trying to advance through a flock of geese, and they're making fun of each other even as bullets are flying. We've got Crawford, who gets so startled by the whole thing that he just hops on his horse and rides away without giving any orders to anybody. He'll eventually come back and redeem himself, but it's quite chaotic. And so Henry Heath will eventually be sent to help Cadmus Wilcox, but it's too little too late. Darkness falls, the Confederates are going to have to withdraw. And so Lee's now got a major problem. I'm going to reorient the room just for a second. And let's say the North Anna River runs right across the front road here. Okay? Here's going to be our road. It comes down from Spotsylvania. Chesterfield Bridge is right here. Greg, you're sitting over Jericho. And as Lee gets together with his senior staff, he realizes he's got Federals across the river right in front of him. And he's got Federals across the river on his left flank. His defensive position in his dreamt is given up in just a couple hours because he didn't dig in. And so when we ask that what if question, this is a problem of Lee's own making because he's too tired and too sick to be thinking straight. And he gathers his staff together under a large oak tree behind the Fox House. And he sits on a stump and he asks everyone, what should we do? How do we respond? And most folks want to just fall back a little bit and defend the rail line, which kind of runs between these positions. The Virginia Central, right here. But the problem with that defense is once the Federals get across, they can outflank it. And if I put my defense here and I refuse my line and just go further and still cut the rail line, still get around me. So it's not a really great position. But then Martin Luther Smith, who we've talked a little bit about, comes up with a different idea. He says instead of doing just a kind of a parallel defense, position over here where Charles is sitting is a ford called Ox Ford. And the southern bank really stands high over this. What if we anchor our position there and we fall back in a diagonal this way and then follow the railroad track? And we fall back in a diagonal this way and anchor our line on a little river over here. And it becomes known as the inverted V. And this is, again, one of Lee's great strengths. In a moment of crisis, he can innovate. And so he's going to take what is a terrible, terrible situation and come up with a brilliant response. And so as a result of this defense, it's got lots of different benefits because it's going to take advantage of some ridge lines. As Hancock comes across the bridge that he has captured and moves into this open plain, he gets farther and farther away from Gouverneur K. Warren, who comes down in this direction. That V splits the Union Army. And for either wing to reinforce itself, they have to cross the river. Travel 6 miles, cross the river again. So he sets his men to work to create this position. In the meantime, he then finally goes down to see A.P. Hill, who is not invited to sit with the cool kids under the oak tree. And he says to Hill, this has got to be the most galling thing Hill has ever heard in his life. He says, General Hill, why did you let those people cross here? Why didn't you throw your whole force upon them and drive them back as Jackson would have done? Ooh, that's right, you know? Anybody know much about the relationship between Stonewall Jackson and A.P. Hill? Let's just say they weren't buddy-buddy, right? The two men loathed each other. And Jackson was a man who would not let something drop. And, you know, when he arrested Hill and would not drop the charges, and Lee tries everything that he can get to get Jackson to drop the charges, Jackson absolutely won't. And Hill's like, that crazy Presbyterian fool, I'll get blamed for everything he does. Blah, blah. Oh, it's just bitter, bitter, bitter. So when Jackson is killed as a result of the Battle of Chancellorsville, and Hill is replaced as promoted as one of his replacements, you know, it's kind of like one of these, yeah. And then, of course, he completely underperforms. He's never Stonewall Jackson, never Stonewall Jackson. And then to have Lee throw that in his face, just absolutely galling. But even worse, you know, the reason I let those men cross is because your son told me that it was only cavalry. How do you tell the commander of the army your son screwed up and made this happen? Right? You can't. So he's got two bitter pills he has to swallow. Well, what if Rooney had provided better intelligence so that Hill could have responded more aggressively? Wilcox almost had the day. What if it had been two divisions attacking instead of one? Okay? So what if Heath had gotten there in time? What if Hill went to the battlefield himself to direct the action? And of course, we can't answer these questions. We have a trail of evidence we might be able to look at. Of course, Hill was deeply disengaged at the Battle of Gettysburg when he should have been providing on-the-field leadership. So we can't assume that even had he shown up, he would have made the difference. But these are all questions for us to ponder as we consider how this battle unravels on Lee. When he responds with this inverted V, here's Hill's Corps along a strong ridge. We've got the first Corps here, and we've got Buell here. There's a big swampy area over here helping to protect that flank. So now we've got our railroad junction protected. We're going to have Hancock cross into this area here. We're going to have Warren moving across this area. And as these two wings of the army advance, they get farther apart. Lee intends is to crush the second corps as it gets out into this open field. It's going to swing the trap shut. Morning of the 24th, as Hancock gets across the river, pushing forward. There's some skirmishers that they have to oppose, but strangely, not a lot really going on. When they get across out into that plain, the Confederates have left. Warren finds the same thing over here. There are no Confederates. It's because he's walking perpendicular to their position. He doesn't see them. Burnside gets to Ox Ford, runs into Confederates. He's the only one that's run into anything. And of course, Grant's like, Burnside, just push those skirmishers away, it'll be fine. And so Grant walks into this trap unsuspecting. Burnside being the one to tip things off, still can't get across, and then his Hancock's guys are out here, they're running into some skirmishers here, and Anderson's artillery opens fire, trapping these guys out on the plain. Grant suddenly realizes he has stumbled into something. He orders these guys to try to dig in, protect themselves. He asks some of Burnside's men to come over here and help flush them out. He's also going to send some of Burnside's men up and around to try to flush things out over here. Warren is still like, there's nobody out here. But Grant realizes things are, he's fallen into this trap. And this is where Lee needs to spring the trap. Except that by this point, Lee is confined to his tent confined to his cot, racked with dysentery, fading in and out of delirium, telling his staff, we must strike them a blow. We must strike them a blow. We cannot let them pass. We must strike them a blow. And he can't. As one of the staff officers says, Lee in his tent is not Lee on the field. And here's where we see Lee is the indispensable man of the Confederacy. We've talked about attrition. We've talked about leadership. Attrition among the leadership. Who does Lee have that he trusts to strike the blow at this moment? Nobody. A.P. Hill just messed up the other day, right? He was sick through the whole Spotsylvania campaign. He didn't dig in at the wilderness. He didn't trust Hill at all. Ewell had some good days during the campaign early on, but his position collapsed on the 12th of May, the mule shoe. His men that were nearly overwhelmed at Harris Farm. He has an exceptional day on the march, which Lee gives him no credit for. Lee has lost faith in Ewell days earlier. And Ewell is also coming down with dysentery. It will be a convenient excuse to get rid of him in just a few days. Anderson, he's the linchpin to the position. We can't really move him anyway, but he's brand new to command. He's only been doing this for 2 weeks. And while a solid combat leader, he's not Mr. Razzle-Dazzle. I'm not going to trust the Army to my junior-most corps commander. Oh, for James Longstreet. This is the situation made for James Longstreet, right? Gone. Jeb Stuart, who could have provided excellent intel for this whole phase of the campaign. I don't want to spoil the situation, tell you why it's not there. What Frank talked about. Lee is in his tent, suffering from delirium, and there is no one to take his place. What if he had someone to trust him? As my friend Don Fon says, Ewell possessed more boldness. He might have initiated an attack on his own, but Ewell doesn't. Again, we're asking Ewell to make a personality leap he's not capable of. He would have been earlier in the war, but not anymore. Walter Taylor, Lee's subordinate, says that, this could have worked out a little differently. It wasn't our fault. We could have crushed him. We could have driven him back. But Grant doesn't fall for this. Once he figures out his problems, he defends himself rather than trying to launch himself into a headlong attack. What if he had? Well, we know that he says to make an attack would have caused a slaughter of men that even success would have justified. He's learned some lessons over these past weeks, hasn't he? When we talk about, that great illustration Frank shared with us of the cartoons of Grant and Lee, this is not a cartoon character that Grant is facing anymore. He has learned, right? The Second Corps historian says that if Grant had attacked and been repulsed, then perhaps Lee might have been in a position to sweep forward. Okay? So it was a good thing Grant had not done so. But here's the lesson Grant pulls from all this. As he sits there with his staff in the yard of that old woman. Did Lee really have me just where he wanted me? Well, if he did, why didn't he attack me? And so he comes to the conclusion that Lee is not capable of attacking because his army is too whipped. We've been beating him back and beating him back and beating him back, and look how close we are. We're only 20 miles away from Richmond at this point, considering we started up in the Rapidan. He says, if I can just get one more swing at him, that's all I need, one more swing. And so when you think about, well, why does he make that attack at Cold Harbor? He's just looking for that one more swing because he's convinced that Lee's army is whipped. And from north end, a little bit out of Totopotomoy Creek, where Grant will have success. Bethesda Church will have some success. He'll have success on the 1st of June. And he assembles this attack for the third because he's got in mind the idea that he just needs one more swing. It's exactly the wrong lesson. What if Grant knew that the trap didn't get sprung just because Lee was sick? You think he might have been quite as aggressive moving forward in the campaign? Would Cold Harbor have happened the way it did? Would Grant have shown a little bit more caution? Exercised more prudence? I don't know. We don't know the answers to those questions. But we can know that the ramifications of this illness in this moment are huge. So these are just some of the what ifs that we've talked about today. I want you to think about all of these as moments of contingency. And to me, it's why this campaign is so fascinating. Because it could have turned on any one of these moments. We could say that of any battle. But when we're busy looking at the mud and blood of Spotsy and the fire and fury of the wilderness and those regrets and lost men at Cold Harbor, we jump over this because we have some fighting out here. We have some fighting over at Oxford. We have some fighting out at Jericho Mills. A couple thousand casualties, which to those men and their families is every bit as significant as the casualties sustained at Gettysburg or Wilderness Response. But because it doesn't reach the epic bloodshed of those other phases of the campaign, we look over this. We forget about it. And I urge you to take a closer look at this epic of the campaign because of the psychological components. And all of those big picture themes that we've been talking about play out in ways that have such interesting resonances. And so it's easy for us to say, well, what if? What if? Think about this. And as we look at how this campaign is going to go forward, it's all informed by these very sorts of questions. And when Grant gets to Cold Harbor and he makes those assaults, it's because of all of this. So hopefully I've given you a little something to think about.